Security, my daughter-in-law said loudly enough for the entire dining room to hear. Please remove this pauper from our family table before she embarrasses us any further. The sound of silverware clinking against china slowly faded around me until the room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the soft jazz music drifting from the grand piano in the corner of the ballroom. Nearly 40 people sat frozen beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Monroe Country Club, their eyes moving between Sabrina and me as if they were watching something too uncomfortable to interrupt. I remained seated for a moment, my hands folded neatly in my lap, staring at the untouched glass of sparkling water beside my plate. The white linen tablecloth shimmered beneath the candlelight, elegant and expensive, just like everything Sabrina valued. Across from me, my son Daniel lowered his eyes instead of looking at me. That hurt more than the words themselves. I had spent 38 years raising that boy. I worked double shifts at a grocery store after his father's construction business collapsed during the recession. I sold my wedding jewelry to help pay for his college tuition. I skipped meals more times than I could count so Daniel would never know how close we came to losing our home. And now, sitting in a ballroom filled with strangers wearing tuxedos and diamond bracelets, my own son could not even defend me while his wife called me a pauper. One of the security guards approached slowly, clearly uncomfortable. He was young, maybe 25, with nervous eyes and a stiff posture that told me this was not the kind of job he imagined when he signed up to work private events. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the table." Sabrina leaned back in her chair with a satisfied smile. Her champagne-colored gown sparkled under the chandelier lights as she crossed her arms elegantly. "Honestly, Evelyn," she sighed dramatically, "you could have at least dressed appropriately for a formal dinner." I glanced down at my navy blue dress. It was simple, yes, but carefully pressed. The same dress I had worn to Olivia's piano recital 6 months earlier. The same dress my late husband once told me made me look graceful. Suddenly it felt very small beneath all those expensive eyes staring at me. I reached for my purse slowly, refusing to let my hands shake. Around the room, guests pretended not to stare, though I caught several women whispering behind lifted wine glasses. Sabrina loved this kind of audience. Public humiliation was her favorite performance. "Mom," Daniel finally muttered under his breath, still refusing to meet my eyes. "Maybe it's better if you just head home tonight." Home. The word echoed painfully inside me because the truth was, I no longer knew where home was anymore. Ever since Harold passed away 2 years earlier, everything had changed. The holidays stopped feeling warm. Family dinners became tense and uncomfortable. Sabrina slowly rearranged every tradition until I barely recognized my own family anymore. First, she changed the seating arrangements at Thanksgiving. Then she stopped including me in birthday planning for the grandchildren. Then came the smaller humiliations disguised as practical decisions. She told the caterers not to prepare my favorite dishes because older people don't eat much anyway. She replaced family portraits in Daniel's house with giant black and white photographs of her own relatives. Little by little, she erased me so carefully that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Until tonight. Tonight she wanted everyone to see exactly where she believed I belonged. The security guard stepped aside politely to let me stand. I rose carefully from my chair, smoothing my dress with slow, steady hands. I would not cry. Not here. Not in front of Sabrina Monroe. My granddaughter Olivia suddenly pushed back her chair. "Grandma didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling. Every head in the ballroom turned toward her. Sabrina's smile disappeared instantly. "Olivia," she snapped sharply, "stay out of adult matters." But Olivia kept staring at me with wide, frightened eyes. Sweet girl. At 16, she still had kindness in her heart. I offered her the smallest smile I could manage. "It's all right, sweetheart," I said softly. Then I picked up the small silver gift box I had brought for her birthday and placed it carefully beside her dinner plate. Sabrina frowned immediately. "What's that?" she asked suspiciously. I looked directly at her for the first time all evening. "Something your family should have appreciated long ago," I replied calmly. Then, without another word, I turned and walked toward the ballroom exit while the entire room watched in silence behind me. The cold night air hit my face the moment I stepped outside the country club ballroom, but somehow it still felt easier to breathe out there than it had inside that room. The valet attendants avoided looking directly at me as I walked slowly toward the parking area, my heels clicking softly against the stone pavement. Somewhere behind me, laughter and music resumed inside the building, as though nothing important had happened at all. That was the strange thing about humiliation. For the person experiencing it, the moment stretched endlessly. For everyone else, dinner simply continued. I unlocked my old silver Buick and sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine. My hands rested quietly in my lap while the parking lot lights reflected across the windshield. The small silver gift box was no longer with me. I had left it beside Olivia's plate on purpose. For several minutes, I simply stared ahead at the rows of luxury cars lined up beneath the lights. Mercedes, Range Rovers, a Bentley that probably cost more than my first house. Harold used to joke that wealthy people always tried too hard to impress strangers. Back when he was alive, those comments made me laugh. Now they only made me tired. I finally started the car and drove home through the quiet streets of Ashford Hills, passing giant homes wrapped in warm golden light. Perfect families sat behind those windows. Or at least they pretended to. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the driveway of the small brick house Harold and I bought 41 years earlier. The porch lights still worked only if you flipped the switch twice, and the flower beds needed trimming again, but the house always felt honest to me. No performance, no pretending, just memories. I stepped inside and placed my purse carefully on the kitchen counter. The silence wrapped around me immediately. Ever since Harold died from his heart attack 2 winters ago, silence had become its own kind of roommate. Some nights it comforted me. Other nights it sat heavy on my chest. Tonight, it felt unbearable. I removed my earrings slowly and glanced toward the old dining table near the window. Daniel used to sit there every morning before school, eating cereal while Harold read the newspaper beside him. Back then, our biggest worries were soccer practice schedules and whether the washing machine would survive another month. We were not rich, but our home was full of warmth. Somewhere along the way, Daniel stopped valuing warmth. I opened the refrigerator and stared absently at the leftovers inside. Turkey slices, potato salad, a pie Olivia helped me bake 3 days earlier. I suddenly realized I had not eaten anything at dinner. Sabrina always had a way of making food taste like guilt. I poured myself a glass of water instead and carried it into the living room. Harold's photograph still sat on the fireplace mantel exactly where I had left it after the funeral. His smile looked calm and steady, the same way it always had whenever life became difficult. You would not even recognize him tonight. I whispered softly toward the photograph. Saying it out loud made the pain sharper somehow. Daniel had not always been weak. As a child, he cried for 2 days after accidentally stepping on a bird's nest during a camping trip. At 16, he worked weekends washing cars because he wanted to buy me a birthday necklace with his own money. When Harold's business failed during the recession, Daniel overheard us discussing overdue bills one night. The next morning, he emptied his college savings jar onto the kitchen table and told us to use it for groceries instead. That boy would have never allowed anyone to humiliate his mother publicly. Somewhere beneath Sabrina's polished influence and expensive dinner parties, I had lost my son long before tonight happened. My phone buzzed softly against the coffee table. For one foolish second, I hoped it might be Daniel apologizing. Instead, it was a text from Olivia. Grandma, I am so sorry. Please do not cry because of them. I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back 3 simple words. I am all right. It was a lie, of course. But older women learn something important after enough heartbreak. Sometimes dignity begins with surviving humiliation quietly enough that nobody gets to watch you fall apart. The next morning, sunlight spilled softly through the kitchen curtains, landing across the faded hardwood floor Harold had installed himself nearly 30 years ago. I stood at the sink holding a coffee mug between my hands, watching a pair of sparrows fight over crumbs near the bird feeder outside the window. For a moment, the world looked peaceful enough to fool someone who did not know better. My phone remained silent on the counter beside me. No apology from Daniel. No explanation. Not even one of those cold, carefully worded messages Sabrina liked to send whenever she wanted to sound polite while being cruel. I should not have been surprised. Silence had become their favorite language over the past 2 years. It began slowly after Harold's funeral. At first, Daniel called every Sunday morning like he always had. He asked whether I was sleeping all right, whether I needed groceries, whether the furnace was working properly during winter storms. Then Sabrina started appearing in the background of those calls. Little comments slipped into conversations like tiny needles hidden beneath fabric. Daniel is very busy these days. You know how stressful life can be for younger families. Retirement homes actually have wonderful communities now. Always smiling when she said those things. Always sounding helpful. I rinsed my coffee cup slowly and stared at the empty chair across the kitchen table. Harold used to sit there every morning reading local headlines aloud while pretending to complain about politics. Some mornings he would look over the newspaper just to wink at me. 42 years of marriage creates habits that do not disappear when someone dies. Even now, I still found myself setting out 2 plates by accident sometimes. Around 10 o'clock, I drove to the local grocery store for a few things I did not really need. Older people learn to create errands when loneliness becomes too loud inside the house. The cashier, a young woman named Melissa, smiled warmly when she saw me. "Good morning, Miss Evelyn," she said while scanning my items. "Your granddaughter came by yesterday looking for your favorite lemon cookies. Said she wanted to surprise you." I felt a small ache in my chest at the mention of Olivia. That girl still noticed things. "She is a sweet child," I replied quietly. Melissa nodded. "Not many teenagers think about their grandparents the way she does." I smiled faintly, though sadness lingered beneath it. Children like Olivia did not become thoughtful by accident. Usually, kindness grows strongest in people who spend their lives watching cruelty quietly unfold around them. When I returned home, a black SUV sat parked across the street from my house. For one strange second, my stomach tightened. But then I recognized Daniel stepping out from the driver's side. He stood there awkwardly in an expensive gray coat, one hand resting against the door as though he was suddenly unsure why he came. He looked older than he had the night before. Tired. I remained seated inside my Buick for several moments before finally stepping out. Neither of us spoke immediately. The wind carried dry autumn leaves across the driveway between us. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat softly. "Mom," he said carefully, "about last night." His voice faded before finishing the sentence. I waited quietly. He rubbed the back of his neck the same way he used to do as a nervous teenager before asking difficult questions. "Sabrina was upset," he continued weakly. "The dinner was important for her father's business connections. She thought maybe your clothes were too casual for the event." I stared at him in disbelief, so complete it almost felt numb. Not because of Sabrina anymore. Because my own son actually repeated those words aloud as though they sounded reasonable. "Your father bought me that dress," I said softly. Daniel looked away immediately. The silence stretched painfully between us. "You could have defended me," I added after a moment. "You did not even try." His jaw tightened slightly. "Mom, I was trying to avoid causing a bigger scene." There it was. The excuse weak people always use when they betray someone quietly. Peace. Harmony. Avoiding conflict. I looked at the man standing in front of me and suddenly understood something heartbreaking. Daniel had spent so many years trying to keep Sabrina happy that he no longer recognized when something was morally wrong. "You know," I said gently, "when you were 8 years old, you punched a boy at school because he laughed at another child's torn shoes." Daniel's face shifted with embarrassment. "Mom, you cried afterward because you thought kindness mattered more than appearances." I held his gaze steadily. "What happened to that little boy?" Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. Daniel stood in my driveway, looking strangely smaller than I remembered, as though guilt had quietly bent his shoulders overnight. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The autumn wind carried the faint smell of rain through the neighborhood, while dry leaves scraped softly across the pavement. Finally, he exhaled heavily and looked toward the street instead of at me. "Sabrina did not mean for things to go that far," he said quietly. I almost smiled at the absurdity of those words. People always said that after cruelty became impossible to ignore. They said things got out of hand. They said emotions were high. They said nobody intended to hurt anyone. But humiliation rarely happens by accident. Especially not the kind carefully performed in front of wealthy guests beneath crystal chandeliers. "Your wife called security on your mother," I replied calmly. "That did not happen suddenly, Daniel. That kind of disrespect grows over time." He rubbed his forehead tiredly. "You know how Sabrina is?" Yes. I didn't know exactly how Sabrina was. The painful part was realizing my son knew too and chose silence anyway. My eyes drifted toward the flower beds near the porch. Harold used to spend entire Saturdays planting tulips there every spring because he said homes should make people feel welcomed before they even stepped inside. Sabrina never understood things like that. To her, homes existed. For appearances, for photographs, for social status. Warmth had no market value in her world. "Do you remember your father's retirement barbecue?" I asked softly. Daniel frowned slightly at the sudden question. Of course. Sabrina complained because Harold invited his old construction crew instead of businessmen from the country club. Daniel remained quiet. I continued slowly. Your father spent 30 years working beside those men in the heat and rain. They helped build half the homes in this county. But Sabrina looked at their work boots and decided they embarrassed her. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. She was worried about impressions. I looked at him steadily. Exactly. The words settled heavily between us. Impressions. Sabrina cared more about appearances than character. And somewhere along the way, Daniel learned to value the same things. I suddenly remembered the first time I noticed real change in him. It was 3 months after he married Sabrina. We were having dinner together at a steakhouse downtown when the waitress accidentally spilled iced tea near our table. The young woman looked terrified, apologizing repeatedly while trying to clean the mess. Before I could reassure her, Sabrina sighed loudly and muttered, "This is why places should hire more polished staff." Daniel laughed softly at the comment back then. Just a polite little laugh. But I remembered sitting there in silence, staring at my son, and realizing something invisible had shifted inside him. Kindness had started losing to convenience. "Mom," Daniel said carefully now, "Sabrina grew up differently than we did." "No," I interrupted gently. "She grew up believing some people matter more than others." He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. Because deep down, he knew it was true. Across the street, a delivery truck rolled slowly through the neighborhood, while distant lawnmowers hummed somewhere nearby. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary lives continuing, while families quietly fell apart behind closed doors. "I came because Olivia is upset," Daniel admitted after a while. "She cried all night after the dinner." My chest tightened painfully at that. Sweet Olivia. That child should never have witnessed something like that, I whispered. Daniel finally looked directly at me then, and for the first time since Harold died, I saw genuine uncertainty in his eyes. "Mom, what was inside that gift box you left her?" I studied him silently for a moment before answering. "Something your father wanted Olivia to have when she turned 16. Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I walked toward the porch steps slowly, then paused before opening the front door. "You should ask your wife why she looked so nervous when she saw it sitting beside Olivia's plate." His expression shifted instantly. Small, but noticeable. Confusion first, then concern. I rested my hand against the doorknob and spoke quietly without turning around. Some people become very uncomfortable when they realize they do not know everything about the family they married into. Then I stepped inside the house and closed the door gently behind me, leaving my son standing alone in the driveway with questions his wife had never prepared him to ask. That evening, rain tapped softly against the living room windows while I sat curled beneath Harold's old wool blanket with a cup of chamomile tea cooling untouched beside me. The house smelled faintly of cedarwood and lemon furniture polish, the same comforting scent that had filled these rooms for decades. Outside, headlights slid across wet pavement as cars moved quietly through the neighborhood. Inside, everything felt suspended in that strange silence families enter right before the truth begins surfacing. Around 7 o'clock, my phone rang unexpectedly. I almost ignored it until I noticed the caller ID. George Whitaker. I had not spoken to Harold's attorney in nearly 8 months. "Evelyn," his calm voice said the moment I answered. "I apologize for calling this late, but I believe we need to discuss something important." My stomach tightened slightly. George had handled Harold's estate after the funeral. Careful man, soft-spoken, the kind of attorney who still mailed handwritten holiday cards every December. "Is everything all right?" I asked quietly. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "I attended the Monroe charity dinner last night. That surprised me." "You were there?" "Briefly," he replied. "Long enough to witness behavior that concerns me deeply." I closed my eyes slowly. So word had already spread. Humiliation traveled quickly in wealthy social circles, especially when public drama interrupted expensive dinners. "Evelyn," George continued carefully, "did Harold ever explain the details of the family trust before he passed?" I frowned slightly. Not entirely. He said everything was organized and protected. Another pause. Then George lowered his voice. Your husband was a very thorough man. I set my tea down slowly. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows, while something cold and unfamiliar settled into the room around me. What exactly are you trying to tell me? George exhaled quietly. There are conditions attached to the Carter family trust that Daniel and Sabrina may not fully understand. For several seconds, I said nothing at all. Harold had always handled financial matters privately. Not secretively, just carefully. He believed stability protected families from fear. After the recession nearly destroyed us years earlier, he became meticulous about securing our future. Harold amended the trust approximately 6 months before his death, George explained. Specifically after concerns he developed regarding outside influence within the family. Outside influence. Sabrina. Even without saying her name directly, I understood immediately. My fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. What kind of conditions? I asked softly. George answered carefully, like a man choosing each word with precision. If you were ever subjected to deliberate public humiliation, coercion, abandonment, or pressure regarding your housing or financial rights, the trust assets would become inaccessible to Daniel until an independent review was completed. I stared silently into the dark living room. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed softly beneath the rain. Harold believed. George continued gently. That kindness reveals character more reliably than money ever will. My throat tightened unexpectedly at hearing something that sounded so much like my husband. For years, I thought Harold simply tolerated Sabrina's behavior because he disliked conflict. Now I realized something else entirely. He had been watching quietly, preparing quietly, protecting quietly. Does Daniel know? I finally asked. Not the full extent, George admitted. And judging from last night, I suspect Sabrina certainly does not. A long silence followed. I glanced toward Harold's photograph resting above the fireplace mantel. The same steady smile. The same calm eyes. Even now, he was somehow still protecting me. George, I said slowly, what exactly was inside the silver gift box I left for Olivia? I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it aloud. A copy of the trust acknowledgement letter Harold prepared for her 16th birthday, George replied, along with the original family signet ring belonging to your husband's grandfather. Suddenly, Sabrina's nervous expression at the ballroom made perfect sense. She recognized the Carter family crest engraved on that ring immediately. And if she recognized the ring, then she also understood something else. The woman she publicly called a pauper might still legally control far more than Sabrina ever imagined. George's voice softened carefully. Evelyn, I believe they underestimated you. I looked around the quiet little house Harold and I built together from nothing. The peeling porch paint, the worn hardwood floors, the old kitchen curtains faded by sunlight over the years. People like Sabrina saw modest things and assumed weakness. But Harold and I came from a generation that understood something very different. Some of the strongest people in America once built entire lives with calloused hands, secondhand furniture, and dignity nobody could buy. The following afternoon, I found myself standing in front of Harold's old cedar closet upstairs, carefully sorting through boxes I had not touched since the funeral. Dust floated softly through thin beams of sunlight coming from the hallway window, while the familiar scent of old paper and cedarwood wrapped around me like memory itself. Harold kept everything organized with almost military precision. Tax records and labeled folders. Family photographs sorted by year. Even greeting cards tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. I smiled faintly as I opened another box and found one of Daniel's elementary school drawings folded between old insurance papers. A crooked picture of our family standing beneath a giant yellow sun. Back then, Daniel used to draw me holding everyone's hand. The phone rang downstairs before I could look through the rest. I closed the box gently and made my way back toward the kitchen. Sabrina's name flashed across the screen. That alone told me something was wrong. Sabrina rarely called me directly unless she wanted something. I answered calmly. Hello, Sabrina. Her voice sounded unusually warm. Artificially warm. Evelyn, she said sweetly. I have been trying to reach you all morning. I leaned lightly against the kitchen counter. I was busy. Well, she continued with a soft laugh. I wanted to apologize if things became uncomfortable at the dinner the other night. Uncomfortable. Such a polished word for humiliation. I think emotions were simply running high. There it was again. The language wealthy people use when they want cruelty to sound civilized. I remained silent. Sabrina cleared her throat lightly before continuing. Actually, Daniel and I wanted to invite you to another family gathering this Saturday evening. Something smaller and more intimate this time. My eyes narrowed slightly toward the rain-speckled kitchen window. Smaller and more intimate usually meant more controlled. What kind of gathering? I asked. Just family, she replied quickly. We thought it would be nice to reconnect after all the tension lately. Olivia especially misses you. That part, at least, was probably true. Sabrina paused carefully before adding. There are also a few financial matters Daniel hoped to discuss with you privately. Oh, there it was. The real reason for the invitation finally stepping into the light. I thought about George's phone call the night before. About the trust. About Sabrina's sudden nervousness after seeing the Carter family ring. Somewhere behind her polished voice, panic had already started growing. What financial matters? I asked softly. Sabrina laughed again, though the sound tightened slightly at the edges this time. Oh, nothing dramatic. Just future planning. Daniel worries about you managing the house alone long term. Of course he did. The old house again. The same house Sabrina had quietly circled around for years like a real estate investor waiting for the right moment. I manage perfectly well, I replied. Naturally, Sabrina said quickly. But we all need support as we get older. Older. Another one of her favorite words. Never cruel enough to challenge directly. Just soft enough to slowly reduce a person into something fragile and inconvenient. Saturday at 7? She asked. I glanced toward Harold's photograph above the fireplace. Calm eyes. Steady smile. Patient man. I will think about it, I answered carefully. Sabrina hesitated. Evelyn, about the gift box the other night. There it was again. Fear hiding beneath politeness. I let the silence stretch deliberately before responding. What about it? Olivia seemed confused by the documents inside. Her voice sounded lighter now, too careful, too rehearsed. I wondered whether perhaps there had been some misunderstanding. I almost smiled. Sabrina was fishing carefully without wanting me to notice the hook. No misunderstanding, I replied quietly. Another pause followed. Then Sabrina's polished tone slipped for just 1 second. Daniel was not aware those documents existed. Neither were you, I thought silently. Harold believed in preparing for the future, I said calmly. He was always very thorough. Silence settled heavily on the line after that. Finally, Sabrina recovered her smooth, social voice again. Well, she said lightly, we look forward to seeing you Saturday. The moment the call ended, I set the phone down slowly and walked toward the living room window. Outside, clouds drifted low across the neighborhood, while wind bent the tall maple trees near the sidewalk. Somewhere in that enormous, expensive house across town, Sabrina Monroe was realizing something deeply unsettling. The woman she dismissed as weak and outdated might still hold more power than anyone at that dinner table ever imagined. And for the first time in a very long while, I realized something too. Quiet people are often underestimated because they spend years learning how to survive storms without announcing their strength. Saturday evening arrived cold and gray, with heavy clouds hanging low over Ashford Hills like a storm waiting patiently beyond the horizon. I stood in my bedroom adjusting the collar of Harold's cream-colored wool coat, while soft instrumental music played quietly from the old radio near the dresser. For several moments, I studied my reflection carefully. Silver hair pinned neatly back. Pearl earrings Harold gave me on our 30th anniversary. Navy blue dress pressed perfectly smooth despite its age. Sabrina once said old things lose value with time. Harold believed the opposite. Some things become more meaningful simply because they survive longer than expected. I picked up my purse and paused beside Harold's photograph before leaving the house. Let us see how honest they are tonight, I whispered softly. Rain began falling lightly during the drive across town, streaking silver across the windshield beneath glowing streetlights. Daniel and Sabrina's house sat at the top of a quiet hill inside one of the wealthiest gated neighborhoods in the county. Massive windows cast warm golden light across the wet driveway, while luxury cars lined the curb outside. Smaller gathering, Sabrina had said. Clearly that was another lie. Through the front windows, I could already see guests holding champagne glasses and laughing beneath enormous crystal fixtures hanging from the ceiling. Everything in Sabrina's world depended on performance. A valet opened my car door politely as I arrived. "Good evening, ma'am." I thanked him quietly and stepped toward the entrance, my heels clicking softly against the stone walkway. Before I reached the front door, Olivia suddenly appeared from inside the house and hurried toward me through the rain. "Grandma." Her voice sounded relieved. She wrapped her arms around me carefully without worrying about her expensive dress becoming wet. I held her tightly for a moment, breathing in the faint scent of vanilla perfume and rainwater. "You should not have come tonight," she whispered nervously. I pulled back slightly to look at her face. "Why?" Olivia glanced toward the brightly lit house behind her before lowering her voice. "Mom and Dad have been arguing all afternoon, ever since Grandpa's attorney called yesterday." Oh, so George had already started moving pieces quietly into place. "What kind of arguments?" I asked gently. Olivia hesitated. "Mom keeps saying Grandpa must have changed paperwork before he died. Dad thought she was overreacting until yesterday." She swallowed hard. "Grandma, did Grandpa leave you something important?" I looked at that sweet, worried face and realized Olivia still believed families should protect one another. Harold would have loved that about her. "Your grandfather left me respect," I answered softly. "And sometimes that becomes more valuable than money." Olivia looked confused, but nodded anyway. Before she could say anything else, the front door opened suddenly. Sabrina stood beneath the warm chandelier light, wearing a dark emerald gown that shimmered like polished glass. Her smile appeared flawless from a distance. Up close, I noticed tension hiding around her eyes. "Evelyn," she called sweetly. "We were beginning to wonder whether you changed your mind." I stepped inside slowly while servants collected coats from arriving guests nearby. Expensive perfume and candlelight filled the enormous entry hall. Around us, conversations softened slightly as people recognized me from the previous dinner incident. Sabrina noticed it too. Her smile tightened almost invisibly. "You remember the Whitmans?" she asked brightly, guiding me toward the living room where several wealthy couples stood near the fireplace. "And Senator Delaney just arrived a few minutes ago." Of course he had. Sabrina always invited important people whenever she needed witnesses for something. Daniel emerged from the dining room moments later, adjusting his tie nervously the second he saw me. He looked exhausted. Not angry. Exhausted. "Mom," he said quietly. I nodded politely, but noticed how his eyes immediately drifted toward the silver folder tucked beneath Sabrina's arm. There it was. The real reason for tonight's gathering sitting. Right in plain sight. Paperwork. Signatures. Future planning. I suddenly realized something important. Sabrina had not invited me here to reconcile. She invited me because she was afraid. Fear changes people. It sharpens smiles, tightens voices, makes polite conversations feel rehearsed. As a server passed by carrying champagne glasses, Sabrina gently touched Daniel's arm and said something too quietly for nearby guests to hear. But I noticed the way his shoulders stiffened afterward. Whatever was happening between them had already stopped being simple greed. Somewhere beneath all the polished appearances and expensive wine, panic had begun quietly spreading through the Carter household. And tonight, everyone in that beautiful house was about to discover why Harold Carter never underestimated the woman he spent 42 years loving. The dining room glowed with soft amber light as guests slowly gathered around the enormous mahogany table at the center of the house. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath chandeliers while servers moved gracefully between expensive floral arrangements and polished silverware. Everything looked beautiful in the way magazines like to photograph wealthy families. Perfect lighting, perfect wine, perfect smiles carefully hiding imperfect people. I remained near the far end of the room beside Olivia, while conversations floated quietly around us. Sabrina moved through the crowd with practiced elegance, touching shoulders lightly, laughing at jokes half a second too long, performing warmth the same way actresses perform happiness in commercials. But beneath all that polish, I noticed something else tonight. She kept checking the front hallway every few minutes. Waiting. Nervous. Daniel stood near the fireplace speaking with Senator Delaney, though his distracted eyes repeatedly drifted toward me and then back toward the silver folder resting near Sabrina's seat at the table. Whatever papers sat inside that folder had already poisoned the atmosphere of the evening. "Dinner is served," Sabrina announced brightly at last. Guests began taking their seats while soft classical music played somewhere overhead through hidden speakers. I noticed immediately that my place card sat at the far corner of the table, separated from the family by 2 empty chairs and a decorative centerpiece large enough to block conversation. Another small humiliation disguised as etiquette. Olivia frowned when she noticed it too. "Grandma should sit with us," she said quietly. Sabrina's smile never moved. "This arrangement works best for everyone tonight." Of course it did. I pulled out my chair calmly and sat down without protest. Sometimes silence unsettles cruel people more than arguments ever could. Plates arrived. Wine was poured. Conversation rose carefully around politics, investments, private schools, and vacation homes along the coast of Maine. The usual subjects people discuss when they want others to measure their importance. Halfway through dinner, Sabrina finally placed the silver folder gently onto the tablecloth beside her wine glass. There it was, the real event of the evening stepping quietly into the open. "Before dessert," she said smoothly, "Daniel and I wanted to discuss something important regarding future family planning." Several guests exchanged curious glances. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. I folded my napkin neatly across my lap and waited. Sabrina opened the folder with elegant precision. "As everyone knows," she continued, "Evelyn has been living alone since Harold passed away." There was that careful sympathy in her voice again, the kind people use when pretending concern while arranging someone else's disappearance. Managing a property alone at her age can become overwhelming, Sabrina added gently. "So Daniel and I researched several wonderful retirement communities nearby." A heavy silence settled across the table. Olivia immediately looked horrified. Daniel stared downward at his untouched wine glass. I said nothing. Sabrina slid several glossy brochures across the table toward me. Smiling elderly couples stood printed across the covers beside swimming pools and garden paths beneath slogans about comfort and peace of mind. "We even found one with 24-hour medical staff," Sabrina said softly. "It would really be the safest option." Safest. Such a polite word for removal. I looked slowly around the room, around all those expensive faces pretending not to watch too carefully. Then I lifted one brochure gently between my fingers. "You planned all of this before inviting me tonight?" I asked calmly. Sabrina gave a small rehearsed sigh. "Evelyn, please do not make this emotional." Emotional. Another favorite word people use whenever they want older women to remain quiet while losing pieces of their lives. Before I could answer, the front doorbell echoed sharply through the house. Sabrina froze almost invisibly. Daniel looked up immediately. A servant crossed the room toward the foyer while every conversation at the table softened uncertainly. Moments later, footsteps approached across the marble floor. Then George Whitaker entered the dining room, carrying a leather briefcase beneath one arm. Rainwater still clung lightly to his dark overcoat. The moment Sabrina saw him, color drained slowly from her face. George removed his gloves calmly and looked directly toward me first. "Good evening, Evelyn," he said politely. Then his eyes shifted toward Daniel and Sabrina. "I apologize for arriving unannounced," he continued evenly. "But given tonight's discussion regarding Mrs. Carter's future housing and financial status, I believe it is time certain legal matters are clarified before anyone makes another very serious mistake." The entire dining room fell silent as George Whitaker placed his leather briefcase carefully onto the edge of the table. Even the servers stopped moving. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while candlelight flickered across nervous faces frozen beneath the chandeliers. Sabrina recovered first, though the tightness in her smile betrayed her. "George," she said lightly, "this is a private family dinner." "That is precisely why I am here," he replied calmly. Daniel rose slowly from his chair. "George, what is going on?" George removed several documents from his briefcase with the steady patience of a man who understood the value of timing. "Before any discussions continue regarding Mrs. Carter's future residence, finances, or medical autonomy," he said evenly, "certain provisions within Harold Carter's estate must be formally acknowledged." Across the table, Sabrina's fingers tightened around her wine glass. I noticed immediately. Fear changes the body before it changes the face. George opened one of the folders and adjusted his glasses. 6 months before his death, Harold Carter amended the Carter family trust under legal advisement. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Senator Delaney quietly set down his fork. Nobody wanted to appear interested, yet nobody could look away. George continued. The amended trust contains protective clauses specifically designed to safeguard Evelyn Carter from coercion, forced relocation, public humiliation, financial manipulation, or abandonment by direct heirs or related parties. The room became so still I could hear the rain more clearly now. Daniel stared blankly at George as though trying to translate words that suddenly no longer belonged to his world. Sabrina finally spoke. "That is ridiculous." Her polished voice cracked slightly on the last word. George calmly slid another document across the table toward Daniel. "Your father anticipated potential disputes involving social pressure and financial influence within the family structure." Daniel's eyes moved quickly across the pages while color slowly drained from his face. "What does this mean?" he asked hoarsely. George folded his hands calmly. "It means that any verified attempt to pressure Evelyn Carter into surrendering her residence, legal authority, or financial independence immediately freezes discretionary access to all Carter Trust assets pending independent review." Sabrina's chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor as she stood up. "This is manipulation," she snapped. Harold was elderly and emotional near the end. George looked at her with remarkable calm. "Harold Carter was one of the most meticulous clients I have represented in 40 years. Sabrina opened her mouth again, but this time no words came out. Around the table, guests avoided eye contact entirely now, because suddenly the story had changed. I was no longer the fragile old widow embarrassing her wealthy family. Sabrina Monroe was now the woman publicly accused of trying to remove her mother-in-law from her own life for financial gain. Daniel looked physically ill. "Mom," he whispered softly, turning toward me. I met his eyes quietly across the long, candlelit table. "Your father loved you very much," I said gently. "That is why he hoped you would never become the kind of man who mistakes silence for goodness." Daniel lowered his head immediately. Beside me, Olivia wiped tears from her eyes. "Sweet child, some lessons arrive too early in life." Sabrina suddenly laughed once, sharp and breathless. "You cannot seriously expect people to believe I was trying to harm Evelyn." George's expression never changed. "You publicly had security remove her from a family event 3 nights ago in front of multiple witnesses." The room went completely silent again. Sabrina looked around desperately now, searching for support that no longer existed. But wealthy people understand danger quickly. And tonight, Sabrina had become dangerous to associate with. "This is absurd," she muttered weakly. "I was protecting the family image." I almost pitied her then. Almost. Because somewhere along the way, Sabrina truly convinced herself appearances mattered more than humanity. That expensive homes mattered more than loyalty. That polished reputations mattered more than kindness. I rose slowly from my chair and folded my napkin neatly beside my untouched dessert plate. Every eye in the room followed me. "Do you know the saddest part of all this?" I asked quietly. Nobody answered. I looked directly at Daniel. "Your father and I spent our entire lives building a family, so our children would never feel ashamed of where they came from." My voice remained calm, steady. "But somewhere along the way, you both became so desperate to look important that you forgot how to treat people with dignity." Daniel's eyes filled instantly with regret. Sabrina looked away completely. I picked up my purse slowly while George closed the folder beside him. Then, without another word, I walked toward the front door of that enormous, beautiful house. Olivia hurried after me before I reached the foyer and wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders. "I am sorry, Grandma," she whispered through tears. I kissed her forehead softly. "None of this belongs to you, sweetheart." Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Cool night air drifted through the quiet neighborhood, while porch lights glowed warmly against wet sidewalks. As I walked toward my old silver Buick, I realized something unexpected. For the first time since Harold died, I no longer felt invisible. They had tried to reduce me into someone small enough to dismiss. But dignity does not disappear simply because other people stop recognizing it. Sometimes it waits quietly beneath heartbreak until the world finally reveals who truly lost their worth.